As this Shabbat and this week, we are commemorating, recognizing, and remembering Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura. We have a very special speaker from within our own congregation, and I'm not going to speak very long, but just very honored that Hedy Milgrom is sharing her family story this Shabbat morning, entitled Resilience and Hope, My Parents' Story of Survival.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. And thank you, Rabbi Hal, for having invited me to speak this morning. I am filled with emotion. I am proud, I'm humbled to be in the presence of all of you, especially after hearing everybody share their little snippets. Any one of you could have been up here giving your story today. That said, it's my honor to be able to talk with you about my parents' story and to share a few moments with you about that. For the past 5 years, I've been presenting my parents' story both in person and on Zoom to students in various schools throughout Northeast Ohio. I always begin by introducing myself with a short vignette. Some years ago, I was summoned to jury duty. On the first day, I was called to Judge David C. Mataya's courtroom as part of a jury pool. And as part of the voir dire process, Judge Mataya said that we was going to go around and ask each of us to introduce ourselves and to say something about ourselves that would allow the attorneys and the judge to know who we are and if we'd be suitable to serve on the jury. I was somewhere in the middle of the pack, so I had a couple of minutes to stew about what I was going to say, but I knew right away. When it was my turn, I said, "My name is Hedy Milgrom, and I am the daughter of Holocaust survivors." When I speak with the students after that intro, I share with them the goal of my presentation. I want them to hear the story of two people who survived. I tell them Joseph Stalin's strategy for eradicating masses of humanity. When one person dies, it's a tragedy. When 1 million people die, it's a statistic. So when we hear the statistic of 6 million people died, that inconceivable number, it renders it moot. But we all know that each of those 6 million souls had a very valuable and meaningful story to tell. The older I get, the more I realize how profoundly shaped my identity is by being the daughter of survivors. Growing up, Mom and Dad spoke little, if at all, about the Holocaust experiences. Sure, I saw the number on my mom's arm. She explained that she'd been imprisoned by some very bad people who tattooed that on her arm. I also knew that Dad had lost his parents, his brothers, his sisters, his nephews, his cousins, and too was imprisoned and enslaved by the Nazis. The enormity of it all didn't sink in with me, and truthfully, it never will. My sister Marlene and I knew we had no grandparents, unlike all the rest of our friends. But we had moms, brothers, and sisters, our aunts and uncles, and lots of cousins, and they all lived within a 50-mile radius of Joliet, Illinois, where we were living and where I grew up. Dad had one half-brother, Uncle Natan, who lived in Buenos Aires, who Dad last saw when my dad was 2 years old, but with whom he communicated. Dad also had one nephew, Jan Liban, who went back to his hometown of Krakow after the war. Twice a year, my dad would send his nephew a package of clothes, toiletries, Hershey's chocolate bars, and always tucked in a hiding place, some cash that he hoped would get past the communists who undoubtedly inspected every package. Dad, Mark Pufalis, was born in 1916 in Krakow. He shared very few details of his childhood. He was the youngest of 9 children, and by all accounts, spoiled rotten. The only picture we have of my dad is this one. This is, a very low-tech presentation. If we were on Zoom, I'd be showing you a PowerPoint. This is my dad, his parents, my grandparents, and his 2 sisters. My grandfather had 6 older children by his first wife, who passed away, and then he married my grandmother. My grandfather was a shochet, and his business was below their apartment. Dad talked about his favorite treat, what they would all fight over, and that was the unlaid eggs that were found inside the chickens after they were slaughtered. He would also go and describe Pesach, where unlike us growing up, we had separate pots and pans and dishes for meat and milk. In Krakow, Pesach was all meat. I asked him, I said, "Daddy, what did you eat for breakfast?" He said, "The most delicious thing, matzah smeared with schmaltz." I know that Dad went to Cheder. I know that he never learned to ride a bicycle or to swim, and I know he went to gymnasium and that he worked in a cosmetics shop. But I don't know if he had girlfriends, and I don't know why he was still single at the age of 26. This picture, only the other picture that we have of my family before the war, is at my dad's sister's wedding, and this was taken in 1935. This is my father up here. I know it's hard to see. You'll be able to see some of these later if you like. But there are about 35 people in this picture. Certainly not the whole family, but aunts, uncles, cousins, a few other people. 7 years after that picture was taken, all but 3 of those people were dead, all murdered by the Nazis. My dad came home to their apartment in the ghetto one day in 1942 and found that everyone was gone. He somehow met up with his nephew, Jan Liban, and they were on the run for 3 days, but ultimately became separated. Jan was ultimately saved by Oskar Schindler. My dad was then rounded up and taken to the first of 3 slave labor and concentration camps, where among other things he worked in a munitions factory. I know few details about the next 3 years. Like many other prisoners, he made some alterations to the things he was building so that the munitions would malfunction when they got on the battlefield. One of the lasting mementos of his time in the factories, a result of various acids and chemicals dripping on his legs, was a very large, brown, shiny patch that was like a giant scab that was on the full length of his shin on his left leg. It was always oozing and causing him discomfort the rest of his life. I do know that Dad was liberated from Buchenwald on April 11th, 1945, a date he always called his second birthday, and we always commemorate that. He did that until the day he died in 2010. We're going to talk about my mom and aunt now. This is a picture of Pearl and Helen Herskovic. They're the little babies here, and they were identical twins. I don't know if you can appreciate how identical they are from where you're sitting. But these are 2 of their older sisters, Malka and Miriam. They were born in the Carpathian Mountain region of what was then Czechoslovakia in 1921. They were also the youngest of 9. We know much more about Mom and Aunt Helen and her family experience and their experience at Auschwitz. Some of you here knew my parents well, others of you got to meet them. And some of you also had the privilege in 2011 and then once again in 2012 to hear my Aunt Helen speak about their experience. My Aunt Helen lived in Skokie, Illinois, and came here a few times. The twins had an idyllic childhood and adolescence. They were doted on by their parents and older siblings. Their father, a tailor, made them a beautiful wardrobe of identical dresses and coats, and they dressed in identical clothes well into adulthood. Their entire village of Chenadiev, outside of the big city of Munkac, knew the Herskovic twins. Mom and Aunt Helen told many stories of playing tricks on boyfriends and even their siblings by switching their identities and pretending to be the other. My favorite story happened when Mom was a student at the Teachers College in Munkac. There were quotas already in place, and only 2 Jewish students were allowed in each class of about 50 students. So my mom was picked, my Aunt Helen was not. One night, Aunt Helen was at the movies with a group of friends, and she noticed someone staring at her with a lot of disgust and scorn. And she couldn't figure it out, and she tried to ignore the person. The next day, my mom was called into the headmaster's office at the school. He was furious with my mother and demanded to know why she was out cavorting and going to movies when she knew that that violated the rules of conduct of the Teachers College. Well, my mother said to him, "I wasn't out doing those things. That wasn't me." Well, that infuriated him even more because he knew who he saw. He knew it was my mother. And then she realized, "Oh, you saw my twin sister." Well, he got even angrier, and he accused her of lying. And then he said, "If that was really a twin sister, you bring her here tomorrow, and if not, you're expelled." Well, my Aunt Helen came with my mother to school the next day. He about fell off his chair, and my mother got to stay, but of course he never apologized. She was, after all, a Jew. But of course, there's another story to the identical twins. In 1944, they were deported along with their father, 2 brothers, oldest sister, her husband, and 3 daughters. And they spent their days in the cattle car in subhuman conditions. Mom told the story how after a day or 2, they had no food. They were cramped, if you can imagine, this long car with a bucket in one end, a bucket in the other, only places to relieve yourselves, and everyone standing because there was no room to sit down. But she told the story how one of, I think her aunt had an onion that they passed around everybody in the car, and they all took a lick. That was their food. Ultimately, they arrived in Auschwitz. As they were pushed off the train, the first thing that Mom heard and saw was an orchestra playing on the platform, welcoming them. Mom turned to my aunt and said, "See, it can't be all bad. There's music here." It's unimaginable to me. Even after living in degradation and unspeakable conditions for those days, the sounds of familiar music elicited hope. Well, that was my mother. When they emerged from the cattle cars at Auschwitz, they met the angel of death, Joseph Mengele, who shouted, "Twins, step out." Now, there were dozens of pairs of identical twins on the transport, and apparently that was true all over. This is just one page, one little part of the alphabet of the transcript of the twins that were on the train with my mom. Way down here, here they are, numbers A5079 and A5080. Gisela Herskovic, my mother was Gisela, and Helena Herskovic. They were 23 years old. It's particularly heartbreaking to look at this list and see 4-year-old twins, 7-year-old twins, who were yanked from their parents' arms, and then their parents were selected to go that way, to the gas chambers, and then they were taken the other way to be part of Mengele's experiments. So Mom and Aunt Helen never shared very many details about what Mengele did to them. They told us about how every day they were brought to his examination room and sat naked next to him on the table. Remember, they're 23 years old each. They told me that he was always measuring them. She didn't know what they were measuring her for, but measuring them, and that they were frequently subjected to injections of some substance, obviously some kind of a virus or something that was toxic. Sometimes they would end up freezing. Other times they would be feverish and hot. They never found out what those substances were, but my aunt, after she was liberated, had decades of stomach problems that were ultimately diagnosed 35 years later as being tuberculosis of the bladder. They were cured after many months of antibiotics, but clearly this was something that she picked up in the concentration camp. Suffice it to say that their survival was a miracle that neither of them or the rest of their loving family ever took for granted for 1 second. Other things were more difficult for Mom to tell Marlene and me. One day in May of 1974, I picked up a copy of the Chicago Sun-Times, which I read every day. That week, the paper was doing a feature on Joseph Mengele. It was a week-long feature, and they were talking about conjecturing as to where he was. They knew he was probably in Argentina, but they weren't sure. I opened the paper to page 4, where the story was continuing that day, and saw this full-page article in the paper. Picture of my mom and my aunt, and there's a lot of stuff in here, most of which I had never known before. And my mom and aunt were frequently interviewed. They were subjects of some books and different articles because they were known to be survivors of Mengele's experiments. But I read, one of the things that I read in there was part of a day that my mom described about how one day a guard came into the barracks and said they were looking for volunteers for a job. She and Aunt Helen stepped forward as they wanted to be busy, and they had hoped that if they cooperated, it might mean an extra crust of bread for them. Well, they were taken to a very large warehouse. When the guard opened the door, my mom and my aunt nearly fainted. There were piles and piles of corpses, pile upon pile upon pile, hundreds of them, thousands of them. The guards told them to move the corpses from one location to another and shouted at them 2 at a time. Of course, at this point, my mom and my aunt are about 70 pounds. 2 at a time. She said the job lasted for them a week and then they got sick. I was hysterical reading this and confronted Mom. Why didn't you ever tell me about this before? Knowing that I would have read that article, my mom looked at me and said, "How could I tell you?" The trauma of that experience stayed with Mom the rest of her life. I never knew about it, really, until just a few years before she passed away. My father did all the grocery shopping, which I never looked at as being unusual because my mom had a business in the house, but she rarely went into a grocery store. And it was really just a few years before she passed away that Mom said to me, The only way that Aunt Helen and I were able to move those corpses is because we imagined that they were sacks of potatoes and onions. So I could never go into a grocery store because I wouldn't see sacks of potatoes and onions. I would see corpses and bodies. On January 18th of 1945, that was the twins' 24th birthday, the Nazis learned that the Russian army was approaching Auschwitz, and the SS forced the prisoners, including Mom and Aunt Helen, to go on the death march. There were 50 or 60,000 people who were a part of that. They marched in the snow and in the bitter cold for weeks and weeks and weeks. When my aunt was just too weak to go on, my mother would carry her, because if you sat down, you were shot. And townspeople tried to throw food to people as they saw them marching by, but if you tried to pick it up, you were shot. Ultimately, they noticed that the guards were dispersing, and suddenly there were none of them, and then they realized that everyone was gone and they were free. They were ultimately rescued by a convent in Austria, where the nuns nursed them back to health. Eventually, they made their way back to Czechoslovakia and were reunited with siblings who did not perish. And I have one picture here. This is a picture of my mom and my aunt after they returned to Czechoslovakia, and one of their brothers, he had been in the Czech army, and he was in Siberia along with his wife, and then he also then was let go and came back to Czechoslovakia. These dresses, by the way, were made with surplus fabric that my aunt, who became a wonderful seamstress and tailor like my grandfather, made out of parachute material that they found in a warehouse. So that's where those dresses came from. And their oldest sister, Aunt Malka, who was one in the picture, she married and moved to Gary, Indiana in the 1930s, and she anguished over the fate of her siblings and then found out that they were alive. And so starting in about 1947-48, they slowly came over to the United States. My mom came in 1948 with one of her brothers, and Helen came a year later. When my dad was liberated, an American GI who spoke Polish asked Dad if he had any living relatives. Dad said that he was sure everyone was gone, but he did have a much older brother, Natan, who was living in Buenos Aires. He and Dad had the same father, but as I mentioned earlier, after my grandfather's first wife died, he remarried, and so they had different mothers. The GI asked Dad if he had an address for his brother. My dad said no, he did not. The GI said, write a letter anyway, which my dad did, and addressed it, Natan Pufalis, Buenos Aires, Argentina. Amazingly, 3 months later, my dad got a letter back from his brother. For the next 6 years, my dad and his brother were in communication with each other. My uncle tried to get my father a visa to come to Argentina. It was easy for a Nazi to get a visa to go to Argentina, but not so easy for Jews, so he was never able to get that. But my father ended up in Würzburg, Germany, where he learned to trade. He was supported by the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee's rescue, relief, and resettlement programs. Later in life, he would reflect in amazement that he was so cared for and wondered how it was that these people knew who he was and where he was. He apprenticed as a photo engraver, and he met a woman to whom he became engaged to be married. Sadly, she got sick and she died. Another loss for my father. He wanted to leave Germany at this point, and he and his brother kept trying to get him that visa, but to no avail. So finally, in 1951, he got a visa to come to the United States. He was sponsored by the highest chapter in Gary, Indiana. Dad got a job in the Gary steel mills within days of arriving. When he got his first paycheck, he found the Gary Jewish Federation, the Jewish Welfare Federation's office, and he made a contribution. He wanted to give back to the organization that had supported him all those years in Germany. That single act of gratitude and generosity is the seminal event that this day has inspired me in my work at the Federation. A week after Dad arrived in Gary, he and Mom were fixed up. They had their first date on the 4th of July, became engaged on Rosh Hashanah, and were married a few months later on January 20th, 1952. They moved to Joliet, Illinois, where Dad got a job in his trade at a print shop. Think about it for a minute. After nearly a decade of tragedy, loss, dehumanization, and upheaval, they each moved to a new country, learned a new language and culture, and had enough faith to think that they could find love and actually be happy again. And the greatest faith, the greatest hope of all, was that they wanted to marry and bring new life into this world. Where did that hope come from? Where did that resilience come from? And how do they cope with such drastic changes in their identities? I started off by talking about how I viewed my own identity. If you had met my parents when I was growing up, you would have seen two people completely engaged in their community, devoting their lives to the happiness and comfort of others. Dad spent all his non-working hours in service to the Jewish community. He was head of the small synagogue and services committee at our shul in Joliet for 50 years. He was the rabbi's right-hand man. He and Mom were at every service. He couldn't do enough to help other people. Mom began her own business as a baker and a cake decorator, eventually winning a national grand prize for her artistry and icing, as my father called it. Her business was one of pure happiness and joy, except when your clothes got too tight from eating too much of her baking. Our house was an endless procession of brides-to-be, selecting the style and color of their special cake for their special day. Mom taught cake decorating for years at Joliet Junior College and gave cake decorating demonstrations for clubs and groups where she was as much a stand-up comic as she was an icing artist. Over 40 years ago, Mom began speaking to a variety of groups about her personal Holocaust story. Her identity shifted yet again as she and most survivors realized that if they didn't share their stories now while they were still alive, the Holocaust deniers would swoop in with their revisionist lies. She would proudly call me after each of these talks and tell me that people were so moved that strangers would come up to her after she spoke and asked if they could give her a hug. Back in 2015, at a Violins of Hope program, I spoke publicly for the first time about Mom and Dad and shared a snippet of what I've shared with you here today. As the audience mingled in the lobby after the program, a woman I had not met before came up to me and asked me if she could give me a hug. I felt Mom's presence. I felt her passing the torch to me. I couldn't sleep that night. Talking about Mom and Dad, the stranger's hug, there's this primal scream deep in my gut that I can't let out, I can't reconcile. And then I'm plagued with the guilty feelings of knowing that my worst days and sleepless nights are pure paradise compared to everything that my parents endured. How they lived every day and created such a normal, wonderful life for Marlene and me fills me with love and gratitude and awe. Not a day goes by that I don't think about how if Hitler had achieved his ultimate goal, Marlene and I wouldn't be here, nor would our three wonderful sons, Natan, Ari, and Ben, nor would we have met the three precious women who've come into our lives, Kate, Hannah, and soon Sydney, and our precious, precious grandchildren, Ellie, Josie, Mark, and Carrie. Now that Mom and Dad are gone, it's my responsibility to be their voice. Their stories, along with the stories of countless others, must be heard and remembered. Mom and Dad individually, as a couple, harnessed the hope and resilience within their souls to face each day, trusting that God will protect them. Their children, their grandchildren, and now great-grandchildren are the inheritors of that precious legacy. In my student talks, I close with a call to action for each of them to be upstanders and not bystanders. Some years ago, I had the pleasure and the privilege of hearing the great Elie Wiesel speak at Kent State University. He said something that motivates me to tell this story to all those students, and I hope will motivate my children to do the same when it's their turn. He told us that once you hear a survivor speak, you become a witness, an authentic representative of that person. And then when you speak, you become a witness as well. So today, and I know I don't need to tell any of you this, but you are all witnesses. And this story, as well as your own personal stories, are you to tell as well. And amen.
Thank you, Hedy. It was beautiful. Can I give you a hug?